Okay. I guess I better put this on too. And turn that off. Did somebody just send me a text?
I sent you an email.
Oh.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. I sent to other people.
We're not going to learn the alphabet this morning, but we are going to talk a little bit about it because in the universe of language, the alphabet's the quarks. And for those that are going to hear this on YouTube or other places, I just have to wonder what that means. But all of y'all know. So, if we start with the alphabet, the issue of understanding language in terms of written communication, this is our foundation, the alphabet. So, when we start there, I just asked the question on the first page beyond that, what is an alphabet? And then I started working toward an answer to that question. And the way I understand it, and this could be completely faulty, but I think when Adam and Eve started in the garden, they were talking out loud. So speech came first. It came before writing. And that raises the issue of speech. And the whole point there is that speech is the means of communication between two minds or more, so that the content of the person speaking, of his mind or her mind, is being transferred by speech to another mind, whoever's listening. And it is the means, not the only one, because you've all played charades. You know that there is a way that you can communicate by just signs with your hands or whatever. And of course, in the deaf community, they actually have words and alphabet letters and all of that they can communicate without any speech whatsoever. So when I say these things about speech, you're just talking about the universal norm for communication, and that's the way we talk. So it's the means for imparting knowledge by one speaker to another. And that raises the next question, and that is, what is writing? Because we're asking, what is the alphabet? And writing obviously was developed to meet the need for communication when there's too much distance between the speaker and the hearer. And, you know, we all have constant exposure to that kind of thing, because we're getting text messages and emails and books and letters and postcards and all those kinds of forms of communication that is kept from being able to be done by speech because of the distance or some other issue that keeps us from being able to talk to each other. So writing was actually developed to just meet that need for communication when there's too much distance or whatever other factor might be a prohibitive issue. So the conclusion for me is that the alphabet is simply a way to communicate the sounds of speech when speech is useless or impossible. The alphabet is actually a human invention in terms of figures or characters or something that reminds the person who sees it of the sound that's behind that. In fact, alphabet came from alpha and beta, which are the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, and it may have actually come before that from the aleph and bet of Hebrew, the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So when they say alphabet, they just concocted a name. But the real issue, and I think this would be good for people in the educational system that think that you can teach reading by some other method, but reading ought to be based on sound. When you're trying to teach somebody to read, you just say, this says ah, and this says ba, and this says ga, or whatever. And that's the whole point. is that the letters simply represent the sounds. And if you can get somebody to sound out the letters, then if they've ever heard the word that it's for. Now, this is not universally true, because all of us know that in the language parts that come from other languages, you have like terios. First time I saw that word, it was the riots, because that's the way I sounded it out. That's what it looked like to me, the riot. But that was discounting the French influence on the language. And so, there are any of this talk is in generalities. It's the norm, but there are all kinds of. So in English, the alphabet has 26 letters, and we have over 300,000 words that are rooted in 26 letters. And in Greek, the alphabet's only 24 letters. They don't have a J, for example. And I don't know what the other letter they don't have is. But anyway, in Hebrew, they narrowed it down to 22. But in Hebrew, they don't put the vowel sounds. Most all of the communication in Hebrew is consonants running together. And people that are learning Hebrew learn to see those consonants with certain vowel assumptions, and when they work it out, it comes out sounding like a Hebrew word that they know, and that's how you communicate. You have to get the sound out to the person so that they can know. Now, over time, you get skilled enough at that. Well, I'm sure that if you've had any experience teaching somebody to read, or what, you'll find them saying the words out loud to themselves. They're pronouncing the words as they're reading, because that's how you learn how to do it. Over time, of course, then you just see the words and you already know that, so you just go on, and the more words you know, the easier it is to read all kinds of stuff. But everybody always will at some point run into a word they've never seen before, and they'll look at it and they'll say, what in the world is that? And sound it out, and it still doesn't make any sense because they've never heard the word in their ears. So really, the alphabet was decided on the basis of the need for communication when you can't make the sounds and they can't hear the sounds, and so there's no active speech going on. In Japanese, the alphabet has 46 characters, and get this, in Chinese there are in excess of 135,000. You know what all those bongs on this is? Responses to that baby picture. So. In Chinese, their alphabet has in excess of 135,000 characters. And a lot of those characters are little pictures that they just draw, and that's a character, but it's kind of a picture. They tell me that the word for boat is a picture of a little boat with 8 people on it.
And what is the word? Boat.
Sounds like Noah's Ark.
Yeah. I mean, that's where that symbol came from, was the knowledge of the flood, which has all kinds of implications theologically. But anyway, that's the alphabet issue, and so I want you to look at some letters that I chose in order of their alphabetical position: A, D, E, and R. And the question here is, how many words can these quarks of the language, this alphabet stuff, how many words can be formed from these 4 letters? How many? I mean, what letters do you see there? What words, Jules? All 4 of them.
Dead.
What?
Dead.
Read.
And it's not D-E-A-D.
D-E-A-R, deer.
That's deer. But it's
sorry.
not D-E-E-R, which sounds exactly like deer. Okay, what else?
Read.
Read. Or red.
Red.
R.
R-E-A-D.
With 3 letters.
Dare.
You have to use all 4?
You have to use all 4.
Dare.
Okay, now that's all I could think of, was read and dare and deer, and I thought maybe there was one more, but anyway. I wanted this morning, by way of illustration, to just use the one that has to do with what we need to do, and that's to read. That's the main, in terms of alphabet, reading is the receptor. The sender is the writing, but the receptor is being able to take that writing and transform it into images in your own mind or concepts in your brain so that you can understand what's being said. And we're so used to this that we probably don't even think too much about it, and it may not be necessary to think about it, but I thought we could think about it, Bill. So, I wanted to put this sentence up here and ask you how you read it, or read it. Read and read are the same spelling,
Yeah,
two
you
different
can read
sounds.
it, you can say it the same way.
Yes.
Both
So
ways.
when you read this, what do you read?
I read the news
One
on
is
the internet,
past
or I
tense
read
and
the
one
news
is
on the
present
internet.
tense.
Right, and the whole issue there is how are you going to tell whether it's I read the news on the internet because somebody said, where'd you hear that? Or I read the news on the internet when somebody says, how do you get your information about what's going on? It's all about sentences before and after, mostly before. So when we add another little phrase, we know exactly how to pronounce that word because it has this phrase every morning. So it has to be, I read the news on the internet every morning, or that could be, I read the news on the internet every morning if somebody asked you what you do last month about getting your information. Yeah, or yesterday. So you see that even on this, when we add the little phrase, the two other words every morning, it really doesn't totally solve the problem of trying to interpret the word R-E-A-D, because it can still be either present tense or past. So in English, we add words so that it becomes more clear. I read the news on the internet yesterday. That has to be past tense. You can't say I read the news on the internet yesterday. Not legitimately. But on the other hand, if you say I will read the news on the internet tomorrow, we have two words. This one, will, and the word tomorrow, and that forces the definition of the word R-E-A-D. Those two words force us to say, I will read, instead of I will read, because that's nonsense English. So, what I'm trying to make the point of, if you haven't picked it up, is interpreting words requires a certain amount of context. You have to have context. And just because the spelling is R-E-A-D, as we've already, Teresa's already pointed out, spelled the same way, but you can say it two different ways and the sounds aren't the same. And when the sounds aren't the same, but the letters of the words are, you need context. And that's true in our studies of the Bible too. You have to have, well, what was Tim's phrase for that? Tim Bargan's?
Context is king.
Context is king. And the more context you have, the more of a king you have. So, if you add a few extra helpers, I have, and then slipped the wrong way. Yeah, I have read the news on the internet for several years. That forces that R-E-A-D also to have a narrower field, or a narrower part in the field of meaning than the word itself can have, on the basis of the fact that it's just a word and you don't have any context. But as soon as you start adding bits and pieces to the context, and as you add these bits and pieces, it forces the narrowing of the word in terms of its actual meaning for the sentence that it's in. So it keeps pushing you. And in Bible study, that's critical.
Is it only the English language that have words that mean different things and spell the same?
I don't think so. I think probably that's, and I'm not, I don't know about very many languages outside of a little smattering of Spanish and Greek and Hebrew. Greek and Hebrew are not, you don't find the same spelling and a different pronunciation in Greek, I don't think. I mean, I can't think of one offhand that if you see these letters, it tells you what the word is. Now, the problem here is in I have read, the word have is a helper word. It's probably not, in the Bible you wouldn't have I have read in the originals, because in the Greek language you have basically a 3 consonant root for a word, and then you have a prefix that will change what this 3 consonant thing refers to, and you can have a suffix at the end that will also make a difference in what the word means. And then sometimes you actually have what they call an infix, where you stick a letter or two in the middle of these 3, and that even changes it more. It's the same basic root, but it's being changed by the additions of prefixes, suffixes, and infixes, but English doesn't have that capability. So in English, you have to use helper words. I have read, I will read, and so on. And that's why I say you have to keep having these inputs in order to narrow the meaning. And in our studies in the Bible, Greek and Hebrew background stuff, we're not going to try to get into the language more than what Strong's helps us to do, because that's a whole different discipline, learning Greek and Hebrew, or those are different disciplines. But we are going to have a method for getting the root from the background word in Greek or Hebrew. So what I'm telling you is, in this course, in just a week or 2 or 3 or 4, I don't really know. We're going to have a way so that you can look at your English text and then find out what the background word is in Hebrew or Greek. You have to have a way to do that. And there are 2 men, a guy named Strong and a guy named Young, who went through the entire Bible, and they listed all of the Hebrew words in every place in the Bible they were used, and all the Greek words in every place in the Bible they were used, and they assigned numbers to these roots. And they gave what they call a Strong's definition, but they had this number. So we talk about the Strong's number, and we'll be talking about that a lot. But the point is, the hardest way to do it is to use a Strong's or Young's concordance, because that means you got to do a lot of page flipping and and for example, if you were looking at the Bible and it said something about love and you wanted to know what that word meant, you'd have to go to Strong's or Young's and look up the word love, and then they would list all of the words love in the thing, and over to the side they'd just say, well, this love is coming from this root, so they put that number, and this word love is coming from a different root, so they put that number, and so on. So you'd have a whole hodgepodge of, and I used to have to do that, but back before the computer age. But nowadays you can have download, if you have a computer, you can download free Bible programs. One of them actually says, this is not to be sold. It's that free. And it will, almost all of those Bible programs will come out with various versions of the Bible, and there are 2 options if you want the Strong's word. One's the King James Version, because that's where Strong's and Young's came from in the old days. They weren't King James only people, but those were the only that was the only translation that was dominant. But now we have these same Strong's numbers put into the New American Standard Version. So you can actually get one of 2 versions, or both. A is the New American Standard and the King James. The New American Standard one is not free. You have to pay about $25 for the privilege of being able to download that version because that's a copyrighted issue. But in the King James, can't copyright something that's 400 and something years old. So anybody can get that. But you do either have to have Strong's or Young's Concordance. You have to have a phone that you can go on the internet with, or you have to have a computer that you can download the programs. And then you don't have to go on the internet at all. You can just work it out on your own system. So we'll be getting into some of that. And I'm going to try to make this course as English friendly as we can so that we can get as much information from the English as we can before we have to go into the other areas. And that's why I said last week, everybody's going to have to decide for themselves just how much you're going to move from here, there, and out. Because it's time, it requires time, so you'll have to assign time for your participation, daily, hope, or at least during the week, multiple interaction things with your homework and that. But you do have to decide. I'm not going to try to teach you Hebrew because I don't even remember most of what I was taught. And I'm not going to try to teach you Greek. Greek is our language with all kinds of grammar and all kinds of rules and all, So, if you have a computer that you can connect to the internet, there's a program called the Word.net. It's just it's two words. It's a single word, the Word.net. That's the one I use all the time. I'm not saying it's the best, it's just the one I use. There's also, I think, a Blue Bible. You'd have to search that on Google to get the web address, but I think it is like the Word.net. But I'm going to be using the Word.net because that's the one I use. And so if you want one that will be compatible to our class without any hitches, well, then you need to get that one. But it's totally free, and they've got all kinds of uncopyrighted stuff you can download for free. And then if you want some of the particular stuff that's copyrighted, then you have to buy it. But it's not terribly expensive. Like I said, I think the NASB with the Strong's numbers is $25, but I'm not positive about that because it's been a long time since that.
Is Strong and Young work together and made one concordance, or
No.
Strong is one Young?
Strong's is the most dominant and preferred one, but Young's is adequate. I used to have both of them. I don't know if I can still find them. We've moved several times since. Some of the stuff we've never unpacked. But a guy named A.H. Strong, I think is the first two. But anyway, Strong's Concordance is so well known, you put that into Google and you'll get all the hits you need and then some. And Young's Concordance probably would get you the same kind of feedback, but I haven't tried it. So, let's go on to the next issue. Homework. I didn't put this on your paper. I did this morning because I don't know how soon we're going to be getting into the weeds. But I want you to divide your time that you're committing to this study, daily or however you're doing it. And I want you to read the first paragraph of the letter of Romans. It's the letter to the Romans by Paul. Chapter 1, verses 1 to 7 is the first paragraph, and I want you to read it over in one setting 3 times, asking yourself this: what is the subject of this paragraph? Okay? And then, once you've read it over 3 times and asked yourself that and still don't have an answer, then just continue your repetitive reading of Romans. Because I want you to keep on reading through Romans, read through Romans, until you're so familiar with it you think, why do I have to do this again? But the more familiar you are with the context of the words, the easier it'll be to understand the words, because context is king. And the English translations, and you can use whichever one you want, but I prefer the ones that were made before the translation theory started changing. Translation theory started with the idea that you should try to replicate the words of the information that you're putting into the different language with words in that other language. Basically a word-for-word translation if you can do it. Because some languages don't have words. For example, we have the word baptize in English. Before the issue of baptism ever came on the scene, English didn't have a word for baptize. So when they read the Greek, B-A-P-T-I-Z-O or D-Z-Z-O, it's baptizo, but it's basically baptized. When they saw that word in Greek and they didn't have an English equivalent, they just transliterated beta for B for beta, alpha for A, and so on. And they just came up with this word baptize as a transliteration of the sounds that give you the issue of baptism that's in your head already because of your exposure to those sounds previously.
What is this scripture again, please?
Romans 1, 1 to 7. What are you talking about?
Romans 1, yeah, the long
1
verse.
through 7.
1 through 7, right.
Yeah, that's the first paragraph.
Okay.
That's just the opening. And I should have reprinted these, but I already have them stapled. And it was this morning when I dreamed this assignment up, so that's why it's not in there. Okay? Now, we've got some other things that we need to shift to. So if you have any issues at this point with alphabets and communication by means of written form because you can't talk it, now's the time to raise it. In fact, just like Austin asked, it was when a question comes into your head, that's the time to ask it. It's not time to ask it down the road later. First place, if your mind's like mine, you won't remember that you wanted to ask that. But that question didn't come into your mind in this class for no cause. Something was triggering it. And normally that'll be my speech until it triggers you to speak. And then when you say things, everybody else in here will be triggered by what you say. That's the way sounds work. Language works. And words do mean things, and they sometimes mean different things to different people because of their background. For example, if I say the word bonnet, what do you think of?
Bonnet, a hat.
Yeah, but if you were in England, what would you think of?
The hood of a car.
That's right. And that's vastly different. It's the hood of your head. I mean, there's a connection of sorts, but in England, it's a bonnet, and for us, it's a hood. In India, when I went over there, I was preaching in a church that didn't know English, and so I had a translator that was standing right beside me, and I'd say something, and he put it in their language. He was good. I mean, there was almost no interruption, and I got to the point where I said something about a cookie, and he stopped. And he said, "What's a cookie?" I said, "Well, it's a little dessert kind of thing, you know." "Oh, you mean what is that word, Hazel?"
Biscuit.
Biscuit. In English, a biscuit is a cookie, and a cookie is a biscuit. So all I'm saying is, when you say something, I say something, the words that are going out there are triggering your minds to go in various and sundry directions, but it depends on your background which directions they're going in. And that's why we have to keep on with the context. So, if you got the homework, basically it just means to read over the paragraph in Romans 1, the first 7 verses 3 times, asking yourself, what's the subject here? And then just go on and read the rest of the book of Romans as you're going, however you're doing that. And so that brings us to one of the first issues of what we call written communication. It's rooted in what is called literary structure. Now, the very basic concept of literary structure is how you take the letters of the alphabet and organize them into a sound or a series of sounds that makes a concept come out of your mouth and go into somebody else's head and recreate that concept in their head. In other words, it's a word. However you spell the word is how you communicate, and that's basic literary structure. And it's kind of like the guy that said, I ain't got no, and somebody says, that's not correct. And he said, did you know what I meant? Yeah, well then it's okay. As long as it communicated the idea. But, humans are legalists at the core, and one of the things about legalism is rules. You've got to have all these rules. When I was teaching English in a high school setting in North Carolina for a little while, we ran into all these rules in English that have all kinds of, well, that's not true in this situation. I after E, except after C. So you don't spell receive, I-E, you spell it E-I, because I after E is the way the letters go until it comes after C, and then you reverse them in your pronunciation or in your spelling.
So is it I before E?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Until after.
Except that you were saying I after E, but it's I
I'm
before.
sorry, it's before, yes.
I thought I had learned it wrong all these years.
No, don't let my goofball stuff.
And words that sound like A, wait.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you spell wait? Well, it depends on what.
W-A-I-T.
W-A-T-E.
That's one of the things that pops in somebody's mind when you say the word, but W-I-G-H-T is the same sound.
Yeah,
But you don't sound out those letters and get the word wait.
no.
So that's one of those cases where the language fails us. I mean, when you're learning to read and you're phonetically learning, you're going to get stumbled by the phonetics because the language deceives us by its goofy variations. But the most basic concept of literary structure is the spelling of the word, the words, so that the alphabet, however you take those 26 letters and scramble them around and put this out there, that's going to determine how people are going to understand what you said, and that's literary structure. And quite frankly, the literary structure issue is being abandoned in many respects simply because all of your translations that started on that theory that you get a word for a word, and then they said, no, what we really need to do is get across a concept for a concept. And that changes everything in terms of translation. And then you have to have the contextual concept. If the tribe or the people or whoever you're trying to get the Bible's information to in their language don't know anything about sheep, the Lamb of God doesn't mean anything to them. So what's the big animal in their culture? Well, it's a pig. Well, that's offensive to most of us. The pig of God, and it does not. Pig will not communicate the biblical concept even in a cultural setting because they don't have this issue of a sacrificial, innocent animal that is going to take away your guilt so that you can be forgiven by God. So there are all these things, and the world's getting more complicated all the time. But when you go into this concept for concept thing, the fundamental problem is this. The person who's translating this concept in this language to that concept in that language may not have this concept right in his own head. And so he's going to communicate a concept that's not there. In other words, interpretation by the translator is going to influence the choices that he makes. For example, I had a Greek teacher in the seminary that I went to who was a wizard in grammar in Greek. But he made the comment one day in class that in Romans 6 when it says you're baptized into Christ, he took that as water baptism. You can't get to Christ through water. I mean, it's just, if it weren't already ingrained by the theological backdrop of people whose theology has come over a period of 1900 or 2000 years, you wouldn't even have some of these concepts because they weren't there. But on the other hand, you'll have some really erroneous ones because the erroneous ones crept in early. This idea that you get baptized into Christ makes you be in Christ becomes a concept where if you're baptized by the right kind of person, typically it would be in those days a priest, well then you're in Christ. Doesn't have anything to do with what you believe or anything. I mean, your parents can take you to the priest when you're a baby and have you baptized and you're in Christ. And that's supposed to confer upon you the basic issues of salvation. You get to go to heaven when you die after you've been in purgatory for a long, long time, but you can tell now what theology I'm knocking when I say that. But my point is, you can't get away from literary structure, and Jesus made it necessary by saying this: not one jot or tittle of the law will pass away till all is fulfilled. Well, the jot is the Hebrew yod, which is the littlest printed letter in Hebrew. If you said a Hebrew letter was 3/4 of an inch tall in the printing, the yod would be 3/8 of an inch tall. It'd be half the size or even less. That's the smallest letter. And then the tittle in Hebrew, the R and the T sounds are only differentiated by a little tiny piece that sticks out on the top of the R. Let me see, is that right? No, it's the D. It's a little tiny piece sticks out on the top. So this line is here and the next line's here, and this little piece here makes it a D, and if you don't have that, it's an R. So, when he said jot or tittle, he was pushing literary structure down to the very alphabet itself, and that's critical for us. So, then in developing literary structure, just like we did when we were scrolling through these things, the following, the spelling of the words, is this uniting of words into sentences. So you take read and you put I in front of it, I read or I read, and then because it can be either of those, you have to say something else. And the first thing everybody wants to know is, what did you read? And you say, well, the red letter edition of the Bible. I reread. Well, anyway. How's that going to come out on YouTube? The point, though, is you start uniting words and you're expanding the context of each word by uniting them, and you're beginning to communicate something with your sentence. And so you put enough words in the sentence to have some literary structure. And then sentences themselves often can be misunderstood, so they're placed together into thought units that we typically call paragraphs. And that's why I ask you to ask yourself, what is the subject of this paragraph? Because multiple, with Paul you can never say there'll be multiple sentences, because his sentences can go on and on and on and on and on and on. But there'll be multiple phrases in the sentences that you have to take into account when you're trying to answer the question, what's he talking about here? What's the real subject? And so sentences then begin to be the basic makeup for thought units that are paragraphs, and then paragraphs are ordered consecutively to carry the author's meaning forward into what we call chapters. So you have this paragraph of meaning, but you want to communicate more information than is in that paragraph, so you add another paragraph to that one, and then your meaning has been moved progressively into the direction of a greater understanding of what you're talking about or what you want to say. And then you might add another paragraph and even another one, and so on. But paragraphs eventually turn into chapters. Like in our studies in John's Gospel, it's pretty clear that chapter 3 is a chapter. Starts out with Nicodemus, goes into the explanation of the gospel, John 3:16 and so on, and then it turns into a discussion about John the Baptist's disciples getting bent out of shape because Jesus' message and John's message in their minds are not connected enough and whatever. But anyway, at the end of the chapter, you have this fundamental verse at the bottom about perishing and having eternal life, and that's what the whole chapter's been about. That's why I started in the beginning by telling Nicodemus, look, you're on real tenuous ground here because you're not going to see or enter the kingdom if you don't start over. So what I'm saying is, when you go into chapter 4, which we started last week, and start talking about Jesus going into Galilee, but it really means he's going to Samaria. You see what I'm saying? There's an obvious shift of the major thought thing. The paragraphs are all going to have sub-issues of a major thought. But when you shift the major thought, you're going to have to start another chapter, and it'll have its own paragraphs and that kind of thing. And then the chapters are produced until the whole book's finished. John said, I wrote these things to you that you might... I wrote these signs to you that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ. But what signs? Well, you have to go back through and pick out. Oh, he changed water to wine. The second one was the healing of the man's son in Cana or Capernaum. And Jesus didn't even go there. He just said, your son's living. And he turns around and walks away. And it's the hour that it happened. He asked his servants, when did my son get better? And they said, at this hour. And he said, that was the same hour Jesus said that to me. So they believe. And when you go through the Gospel of John, you find these miracles or signs that he's doing that are contributing to John's big message. I want you to get into these signs so that you can believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that believing you can have life. So that's the big picture of the whole Gospel of John. Well, then you have the development of books. And that is the book issue, the chapters. But then you have, in the Bible, you have this book, and then you have this book, and you have that book, and you have, And some of those books are written by the same guy, and some of them are not. So you have to be careful about how you're understanding who's writing this and what's the background to that. So what we're doing here is dealing with the fact of literary structure. And then you get beyond the paragraphs and the chapters and the books and that, and you get into, well, how come the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Everybody recognizes that, Psalm 23. How come that says stuff about God being the shepherd that is not the same as John 10, when Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd, I lay down my life for the sheep, and so on. Well, some of the same concepts are connected because they're both shepherd issues. But this one is Psalm 23 is a different kind of literary structure. It's called poetry. And that's literary design. There is a psalm, the longest psalm in the hymn book of the Jews, that has so many verses because they took every letter of the Hebrew alphabet and wrote 8 verses that start with that letter. So they took the first letter Aleph and they started out and wrote 8 verses, and then they had Beit, and then they wrote 8 verses, and so you had 8 verses times 22 letters turned into Psalm 119. That's a literary structure. It's an obvious design by the writer to connect certain truths with the letters of the alphabet. So we're just getting further and further and further into this literary structure thing. But if you're familiar with literary structure, you can understand stuff easier. For example, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is asked to heal this blind man. So he takes him out of the village where they ask him to do that, kind of off by himself. And he goes through some motions to get him to be able to see. And he says, can you see it? And he says, well, yeah, but people look like trees walking around. What does that mean? fuzzy. It means, yeah, I can see, but I can see better now. So Jesus went through the same routine again and then said, can you see? And it says, looking diligently, said, I can see. So he tried to see, and he could. Well, what's the point of that? Jesus couldn't heal the guy in one. I mean, you read these stories about Jesus just saying stuff and it happens, and other times he has to spit on the ground and make some mud. You know. What is all this? Well, these are the issues of how the whole picture is going to come into play, and it has to do with different kinds of genres, and not one of the words, literary design. It's literary structure. Okay, let's go to the next one. All written communication has a written or implied subject, which answers the question, what is this communication about? For example, in a sentence, in English, we say that there's a subject and a predicate with a noun or a verb, either stated or implied between the two. So if you say, Paul wrote the book of Romans, what's the subject?
Book of Romans.
Paul.
The subject of the sentence.
Paul.
Paul.
Because he wrote.
The book
And
is the
that's what he
accusative.
did.
It's the direct object.
Oh, okay.
He wrote the book, but the subject of the sentence is he. Now the subject of the bigger thing may be the book, but the first sentence, Paul is the subject, and the book is the direct object, and
Like-
wrote is the verb that's in between there.
Like the dog jumped the fence, the
Yeah.
dog would be the subject, and jumped was the verb.
And the fence is the object. So some of them don't have direct objects, but that goes in the English grammar.
I didn't do good at that.
Well, in our study of the scriptures, we actually have to know what he's talking about in order to understand what he's saying. And that's one of the biggest problems in interpretation. Literary design when it comes to the question of subject. Now, everybody's familiar with the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are in the Bible. What are they?
Apostles.
What
Gospel.
are
Or
the-
books.
They're the books that
Gospel.
Gospels
Gospel.
were written, and Matthew and Luke and John were disciples of Jesus, like apostles. And Mark wrote his under the umbrella of Peter's influence, so it's connected to the apostleship thing through Peter. But Mark wasn't an apostle, but he was an author of a gospel. Now the question is, why do we have four of them? And the answer is because Jesus is the subject of all four of them, but he's subject in view of certain other factors in Matthew than he is in Mark, and Mark is different from Luke, and Luke's different from John. So if you have a book that's called The Life of Christ from the Four Gospels, just put it over there. You don't want to read that. And the reason is because you can't blend these four into one.
We already have it.
Well, we have it in our Bible as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but a lot of people say, well, if you've read one, you read them all. You have not. If you don't know what the subject is in Mark, you're not going to understand Mark's message. If you don't understand the subject in John, you're not going to understand John's message. The subject is crucial. And that's why this issue is all written communication has either a written or implied subject. Now, by implied, I mean that sometimes you'll have a verb in a rest of a sentence, but it's within a context, a paragraph or a sentence, a group of sentences where the subject's already been identified, so you don't have to repeat that. For example, in English, we say something about John, and then we say, and he said, or he wrote. Well, the he is the subject, but it's John. But in Greek, the he is at the end of the word. It's a suffix added to the triadical rate, basic word. And so you won't have the word he unless it's emphatic. And then they do have a word for he, but they don't use it unless they want to emphasize something. So that's the difference in the languages. But it always comes back to this issue of subject, and it's either stated directly or it's implied. But if it's implied, the sentences around it, the paragraph will identify the implication and you'll know what it's talking about. But if you don't pay attention to the critical issue of the linking of subjects of multiple sentences to produce a concept is the subject of the paragraph, but it's not necessarily the subject of the sentences in the paragraph. Just like the gospel. Paul wrote the gospel, or he wrote the book of Romans. Well, a lot of the stuff that is going to be said after that has more to do with the book of Romans than it does with Paul. But the subject of the first sentence was Paul. And the second sentence may have been something else. And the third sentence may have been something else. But you have to identify the subject in each sentence, and then you have to pull them all into the paragraph so that they blend together and you come up with a subject for the paragraph. And then you take the paragraphs and you do the same thing with the chapters. And then you take the chapters and you do the same thing with the book. Okay? Is this getting complicated enough for you? We're taking it a day at a time. Jesus said to do that. There's enough evil there to take care of itself. So, a day at a time. But one of the first issues beyond literary design, which is the foundation, you can't come up with a subject if you don't have words that are organized, but then you have to ask, what's the subject? And at the paragraph level, as I've said here on this sheet, when you link the multiple sentences together, you have to take the subjects of each of those sentences into consideration before you say, well, this paragraph's about this. And then you know the subject of the paragraph. And if you've thought your way through the paragraph, if somebody says, well, I still think that you're interpreting that right, you can say, well, what's the subject of the paragraph? And if they can't answer you, they didn't do their homework. It's really irritating for people to say, well, I think you're wrong. And you say, well, why? Well, I just think you're wrong. That's so helpful. But anyway, then you just like the linking of letters to form a word, paragraphs are linked into chapters to produce the subject of the chapter. And then the chapters, according to the same pattern, are linked to the complete communication so that the larger subject of the entire communication is presented. Now, this is the process of looking at a book like a forest. But the reading is like looking at the leaves of the tree in the forest. You have to get these details. You can't see the forest without the details, but if you don't see the forest, your details will be skewed. You won't know. That's why the subject is crucial. And then you can start working out the details of what's being said.
So is it, and I may be ahead of myself, but is the original intent to determine the subject of the whole book, or do you start with the details and determine subjects and work them towards the whole book?
It's not an either or, it's a both and. That's why I've been having you read through the book of Romans multiple times through the whole thing, because when you're reading, your mind's processing, and over time you're going to start thinking that Paul's talking about this.
Okay.
By the reading. But when you get down in the nitty-gritty and the details, sometimes you're going to shift that concept that you had out. It's a temporary consideration of the subject, because the details may shift that here and there, and then you're going to get, for example, the subject of all four Gospels is Jesus. But what about Jesus in this Gospel, and this Gospel, and this Gospel, and this Gospel? So when you work with the details is when you come to find out that the reason that Mark told us about Jesus healing a guy in 2 stages, trying it twice to get it done, he wasn't having a problem with healing that guy. He was having a problem with his disciples not picking up on the information he was doing. But basically what he was telling his disciples by this process of this two-stage healing is you guys are not paying attention. Just like this guy couldn't see until he tried hard. And then he could see. Well, in the Gospel of Mark, you have Jesus feeding 5,000 people and gathering up 12 loaves of food afterwards, and you have in the next couple of chapters, he feeds 4,000, and they pick up 7 baskets full, and then they get in the boat and start arguing about who didn't bring the loaves, the bread for a meal. And the whole thing there, Mark actually says that Jesus said, "Do you guys still have a hardened heart? Aren't you getting the point yet?" And everybody wants to know, what point? Well, that's where you have to have read through the thing so that you can begin to see that what Jesus is trying to do is get these disciples to see the significance of his identity as the provider of the food. But it's not the physical food, as John comes along and says that Jesus said. Don't labor for the physical food. So that's what I mean. You gotta read. Reading is taking all the details, but you're taking them in fast. You read the whole thing, and you kind of get a picture, and then you read it again, and you say, well, I didn't see that before. And so you're constantly, your picture's shifting. And the more details you get, and that's why we're going as slowly as we are in our studies, the more details you get, the sharper the picture grows. It's kind of like looking at a piece of a puzzle through a microscope, and then stepping back away and saying, now, what did my view of that piece of the puzzle mean for the whole picture? Well, it may not shift it much, but it might shift it altogether, depending on where those details are and how critical they are. Okay? So you get to this subject thing, and we get to talk for one more minute. Nope, running out of time. I told you we were going to quit if it was in the middle of a sentence. So you already have the next issue, and that's the complement, and we'll be talking about that the first of our study next week. Okay? All right, let me stop this.